Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing editorial webinar series, Coffee Talk. Each hour-long information-packed episode, organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, features the observations and insights of an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. Many thanks to the underwriting sponsor of this episode, Proofpoint, protecting your people from advanced email attacks and identity-based threats, and defending sensitive data from theft, loss, and insider threats. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator. Today's topic is malware, ransomware, and Microsoft 365, what you need to know. And our main presenter is Alan Liska, Intelligence Analyst and Solutions Architect at Recorded Future. Before we get started, though, just a bit of housekeeping. This episode is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. We'll make some time during the talk for questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Our sponsors provided some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. And as a small thank you to the 200 attendees who stick with us to the end, we will be sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. It's a cup of joe to go with the info. Now let's meet our first speaker. During his 15-plus years in the information security industry, Alan Liska has worked as both a blue teamer and a red teamer for the intelligence community and the private sector. He's helped a wide range of organizations improve their security postures using more effective and integrated intelligence. He has written more than half a dozen books, numerous articles, and he has appeared on PBS, NBC, ABC, and did I leave one out? CBS, that's right. You guys are in for an awesome session. Take it away, Alan.
Thanks, John. And I love the fact that everybody is checking in from where they are. I'm in London today, so I'm hi from London. As John said, my name's Alan Liska. I'm a ransomware researcher at Recorded Future, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Microsoft 365. I'm going to start with earlier this month, CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency, released their list of top exploited vulnerabilities in 2022. Once again, that list included CVE 2017-0199. It's a remote execution vulnerability that targeted multiple versions of Microsoft Office. And what that means is that somebody, an attacker who's able to successfully execute this vulnerability, exploit this vulnerability, will have remote access to the targeted system and will be able to download malware and move around the system. This vulnerability has been among the most actively exploited for 6 years now. And I know a lot of us think, well, with auto updates, that shouldn't be possible. But Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Office in particular is so widely deployed, and not everybody updates. And so this continues to be a successful exploit for ransomware groups, for other threat actors to gain access to remote systems. But it's not just this one Microsoft Office exploit. One of the most actively exploited vulnerabilities of 2022 was Proxy Shell, which is 3 different vulnerabilities, both for initial access and once threat actors were inside the network. So what I mean by that is this set of vulnerabilities can be exploited remotely against Microsoft Exchange, but it can also be exploited locally against Microsoft Exchange. So once the attackers are in the network, if they needed to gain access to the Microsoft Exchange server, they could use this vulnerability, and they did use this vulnerability to gain access to it. And unlike a lot of your desktop and endpoint applications, your servers are sometimes a little more complex to patch and upgrade, and so it sometimes takes a little bit longer for those to happen, and for those updates to happen. And when that happens, you see that the top 12 routinely exploited vulnerabilities in 2002, according to CISA, you have Fortinet as number one, and then the next three in the row were these proxy shell vulnerabilities. So the thing is, Microsoft 365 has more than 345 million paid seats worldwide. It is one of the most widely deployed software suites in the world. I don't think I need to tell anybody here that. I think everybody kind of knows that instinctively. Most all of us have some component of Microsoft 365 in our network being used by either you or other people in your network. And that means that it is a huge target for both nation state and cyber criminal groups. And that's the thing, is Microsoft 365 is sort of equal opportunity when it comes to exploitation. We see a lot of activity from cyber criminals, obviously, but also some really advanced exploitation being done by nation state actors targeting different parts of Microsoft 365. Because those parts are so ubiquitous, a successfully developed exploit for Microsoft, for a component of Microsoft 365, will prove invaluable for both nation states and cyber criminals. So we're going to take a look at the ways that threat actors abuse Microsoft 365 for access. All right, so we've already talked about vulnerabilities a little bit, but vulnerability exploitation is one of the most common ways that threat actors take advantage of Microsoft 365. Again, because of its popularity, it's a huge, huge target because they know it's so widely deployed. The bad guys know it's so widely deployed that they know if they're able to successfully exploit it, if they're able to successfully take advantage of vulnerabilities in the software, they will be able to go a long way toward being able to get into whatever network they need to. So even looking this year, just since June 10th, or just since the beginning of June, there have been 10 publicly reported vulnerabilities in Microsoft 365, 8 of which were high severity and 1 that was critical. So out of the 10, 90% of them were things that needed to be patched immediately. And that is how often different components of Microsoft 365 are exploited, or vulnerabilities are reported, and how often they are exploited by the bad guys. And I know I kind of jumped right in talking about vulnerabilities and exploitation and so on, and I'm throwing things like CVEs and criticality around. So I'm going to take a quick second to kind of explain what a vulnerability, when we talk about CVE numbers, what we're talking about. So CVEs are common vulnerabilities and exposures. This is a list of publicly known computer vulnerabilities. They can be software, they can be hardware, it can be a combination of the two, whatever. These are common methods of exploitation. And when a new vulnerability is discovered, whether it's discovered by a researcher, whether it's discovered by a threat actor, and then the person or the company responsible for the software issues, and reports the vulnerability, or if the company itself finds it. However it's done, vulnerabilities are issued a CVE number. In our case, those CVE numbers are stored in the National Vulnerability Database, but there are just different national vulnerability databases around the world. You don't need to worry about that. But in the U.S., we have the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, that keeps track of all of these. So all vulnerabilities start with a CVE. The next number is the year that the vulnerability was first reported. So when we go back to Proxy Shell, CVE 2021 is the year, and then each vulnerability is assigned a unique identification number. And that allows you to track it. So you may have multiple vulnerabilities in, for example, Microsoft Exchange. And when you have those multiple vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange, you want to be able to keep track of which one is which ones needs patching, how quickly it needs to be patched, and so on. So everything has a unique identifier afterwards. And you can see Proxy Shell was released toward the end of 2021. So it's a relatively high number, 34,473. Routinely, the NVD database gets about 50 or 60,000 vulnerabilities added to it every year. So you'll see toward the end of the year, those numbers really start to accelerate. In addition to a CVE number, vulnerabilities are also assigned a CVSS score. CVSS score is the common vulnerability scoring system. This is something that was done by FIRST. We're now on sort of the third iteration of CVSS scoring, and the CVS and CVS talks about the severity of the vulnerability, and it can have a score of 0.1, which is very low. There is no 0. If it's a 0, it's not a vulnerability. So 0.1 all the way up to 10. And those roughly translate to low, medium, high, and critical. So critical is the worst, high is sort of the next level, and so on. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, that is kind of what we're talking about. And I know this is a little bit of a divergence from the main topic, but I really think jumping in and throwing out CVE numbers and CVSS scores and so on, I wanted to take a minute to explain. I will say that one thing to know about the CVSS score is that it is the severity of the vulnerability, but it's not necessarily the risk. So vulnerability, for example, in Microsoft 365 generally carries a much higher risk than vulnerabilities in a lot of other programs, even though, just because it is so widely deployed. So you may have two pieces of software that have a vulnerability that both have the same CVSS score of 8, which is a high vulnerability, but you may have more risk from Microsoft 365, or you may not if you don't have any Microsoft products in your network. So while vulnerabilities are important, they aren't the only way that attackers take advantage of Microsoft 365. In fact, I'd argue that while these while exploiting vulnerabilities happens quite often, phishing and credential stealing campaigns are much, much more commonplace when we talk about threat actors taking advantage of weaknesses in Microsoft 365. So, but when we talk about phishing in general, that's a really broad term. There's a lot of different ways that you can be phished with Microsoft 365. So we're going to take a look at some of the different ways that we see phishing happening with Microsoft 365 products today. So, for example, one of the things that was kind of ubiquitous with threat actors for years was taking advantage of Microsoft Office macros. John, I know several years ago you and I hosted a webinar where I made the joke that any organization that has Microsoft Office macros enabled should just disable it, because I've never met anybody who uses macros that I like anyway. We got a couple of boos from the audience for that. But for years that was really commonplace because Microsoft Office was ubiquitous, and macros allowed bad guys to get you to open a phishing email and run their script without having to exploit anything and without having to engage in any kind of malware or anything like that, because it was all allowed. Macros were allowed, VBScript was allowed, JavaScript was allowed, etc. So bad guys could take advantage of that, and unless you had like an email protection solution that was actually scanning the documents looking for these malicious macros, it all looked legitimate to the tools that you had running on your desktop. So Finally, Microsoft disabled macros by default, which made this attack vector a lot less effective. Still effective because many do rely on macros. So now what we've seen is phishing campaigns switch from relying on macros to using OneNote attachments instead. So OneNote attachments have a lot of the same advantages of that macros do. You can run executables, you can run scripts, you can load things in the background. So you can do a lot with OneNote attachments. And by default, when you install Microsoft Office, you usually install OneNote. You may never use OneNote, but if you have it installed, then you're vulnerable to this kind of attack. And so we're seeing this increase. This article's from January of 2023, but as recently as June and July, I was seeing campaigns using Microsoft OneNote attachments as a way to gain access. And again, the same advantage. It's a legitimate tool. So your email, again, unless you have really an advanced email provider that's scanning for this, is going to allow it through because you may get a lot of OneNote attachments. And then they're running legitimate tools right up until they download that loader. So they're running scripts, they're using what we call living off the land. So they're running the native Windows commands to check the system, make sure it's something they want access to, get the information they need. And they can do all of that without ever having to use malware, which again bypasses a lot of the security solutions that you have on your networks. So, Microsoft OneNote is one way that phishing campaigns will take advantage of Microsoft Office and Microsoft 365. But we've actually seen Microsoft 365 itself used as a phishing lure. So what we see now is phishing as a service operations setting up websites designed to look like your Microsoft 365 landing pages. So they send you an email, say, oh, you need to log into your Microsoft 365 account. They set up, and they often do this on Azure. So it looks like that doesn't look like it. It is Microsoft infrastructure. They set up these landing pages on an Azure host and say, hey, you need to log in here. And they basically can use that to harvest your credentials. So credentials are really valuable in underground forums, especially from enterprise organizations, the kind that have Microsoft 365 products. Harvesting those credentials up to and including ways of bypassing your multi-factor authentication, depending on the type of multi-factor authentication you have. They have ways of interpreting it. So the attack can be really simple. They get you go to this fake website, you put in your credentials, they say, oh, we need your multi-factor authentication to authenticate. You get that. They know that they have 60 seconds to use it, so they have a script that then takes all that information and uses that to log in before that multi-factor authentication expires. And now they have access to your infrastructure, but they also have your username and password. So there are a lot of ways that threat actors are using these kind of attacks in order to gain the kind of access that they need to, again, steal your credentials or gain access to your organization. But we also know that it's not just the Microsoft Office suite. Other parts of Microsoft 365 are also vulnerable. So we know that threat actors have long targeted SharePoint and other 365 administrative tools. SharePoint in particular is of great interest to a lot of different threat actors because there's so much valuable data on a SharePoint server. And when we talk about ransomware, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about here today, ransomware groups in particular love SharePoint because there's such great data on there that they can extort from an organization. So what we're seeing bad guys figuring out ways to take advantage of SharePoint to access it and grab the data that's on there. And in fact, not just with SharePoint, we're also seeing this with OneDrive and other tools that are used by, that Microsoft uses that essentially are used to protect you from ransomware attacks. So, for example, OneDrive, one of the advantages of OneDrive is that it automatically backs up the data that's stored on it. So even if a ransomware actor were to gain access and encrypt everything, it wouldn't matter because they'd have the backups. But just like with your Windows desktop, so Windows desktop makes copies of everything, which is why every ransomware group, when they get into the machine, they delete all your shadow copies. That, unfortunately, is one way to know that in about 5 seconds that machine's going to be encrypted. You'll see them issue the command, delete shadow copies, and then start the encryption process. But just like with the Windows desktop, on OneDrive, there is a delete shadow copy API that attackers have figured out that they can use to delete those backups. So they can encrypt files, they can steal files from the server, and then they can tell OneDrive to delete all the backups. And so, again, that's another way that the bad guys are really taking advantage of this. And a lot of this has to do with the way that ransomware is changing. So if you go all the way back to 2004, when we really started to see kind of ransomware come into its own, that was encryption, then it moved to locking, then it was encryption with Bitcoin, then we moved to big game hunting. In 2019, we started seeing ransomware as a service and then double and triple extortion. And now we're really moving into an era of data theft. So the ransomware actors are much more interested in finding ways to take advantage of your data, to steal your data, and drop that on your network. So, for example, we saw that with MoveIt, the MoveIt vulnerability by Cloth, which really has dominated the summer in terms of ransomware and accounted for hundreds of different attacks, different companies that have been hit by that because it was so widespread when it was exploited. There was no encryption in the MoveIt attack. It was entirely data theft, taking the data off those MoveIt servers and holding it for hostage. And as more ransomware groups are moving to that data theft model, access to your Microsoft 365 documents, access to your SharePoint, access to your Exchange server, access to all of these Microsoft 365 tools and products is much more important to threat actors because that's where your data is stored and that's what they want. And so even if they can't successfully encrypt, it doesn't matter. They can still steal the data and hold that hostage and demand that you pay a ransom in order not to have your data exposed to the world. So that's kind of what we're seeing. And to that point, a lot of people think that Microsoft 365 protects them from ransomware, and there are some tools that protect them from encryption-style ransomware. But as data theft continues to be prioritized over encryption and data theft, then that data, again, becomes much more valuable to the ransomware groups. And because Microsoft 365 holds so much of an organization's data, then it becomes super important for the ransomware groups to get there, and it becomes super important for you to make sure that your data is secured and protected within Microsoft 365 in whatever form that data is stored. And again, just keep that in mind as you're thinking about how you protect and secure your Microsoft 365 data. So I want to jump back to kind of where we've seen Microsoft 365 really being targeted by different threat actors around the world. And these are just some of the things that we're seeing. There are significantly more, and there are other and much more creative ways that threat actors are always coming because Microsoft 365 is such a big target. So bad guys are always finding new and innovative and creative campaigns and ways to take advantage of Microsoft 365. We started with exploitation. there are a lot of vulnerabilities in Microsoft. There are a lot of things that need to be patched and need to be patched quickly because they become quickly prioritized because they're such high risk. We are seeing ransomware actors take advantage of some of the vulnerabilities in Microsoft 365, both in terms of exploitation, but also weaknesses in authentication and weaknesses in ways accounts are managed. We're seeing exploitation in the cloud. So whether that is OneDrive, SharePoint in the cloud, Microsoft Azure services being used to access networks and gather data. Credential harvesting is really, really big. So a lot of bad guys really like the credential harvesting because they can use those credentials to gain access to the networks, and then those networks can then be sold to ransomware groups and other groups that are going to do more malicious actors. So initial access brokers will launch some of these kind of large-scale phishing campaigns specifically designed with credential harvesting in mind because they can use that credential harvesting to gain access. And once they have a foothold in the network, they'll have the ability to turn around and flip that to another bad guy. So when we talk about ransomware, for example, ransomware actors rely heavily on initial access brokers to get the foot in the network, and then they'll buy that access from those initial access brokers, and then carry out the ransomware attack itself. So your credentials could, depending on the size of your network and so on, and the access you have, your credentials could wind up being worth thousands of dollars. If the initial access broker is able to use them to get a foothold in the network and hold that door. So that's why there is this great interest in credential harvesting. We talked about spoofing of, with making it look like Microsoft infrastructure, again, for phishing and for those harvesting and access to file campaigns. And then the broad path of phishing and all the different ways that threat actors take advantage of Microsoft 365 in phishing campaigns. And I know that was a whole lot to cover because it's a really big topic. I see we've got some questions here. I'd love to take them, and I really love the engagement in the audience, and would love to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alan. I want to remind everyone that you can type your questions in the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Okay, let's see. We've got a question here from Lynn. Hi, Lynn. Lynn's a regular attendee of these events. Lynn is asking, Microsoft 365 is widely used for communication and collaboration. What are some of the vulnerabilities that attackers may target within Microsoft 365 environments?
So there are a lot of different ways that we see this done. One of the ways when we look at it, and I didn't even get a chance to talk about this, is when we look at like business email compromise actors. What they'll do is they will gain access to an Exchange server, for example, and they will find threads that are already ongoing and insert themselves into those threads. So if they're trying to steal money from an organization, you may be having a conversation with a vendor. The ransomware actor gains access to that vendor's Exchange server, sees this conversation going, and says, "Oh, great." They insert themselves in, replying as your vendor, but giving you new banking information. So you think, because it's in this thread that's been going on for weeks or months, you think you're sending a payment to your vendor, and instead you're sending it to the bad guys. That's one way that they can insert themselves into communication. I know in Microsoft Teams you have bad guys that will take advantage of that. I haven't seen too much in the way of successful operations with that, but I know it's, again, an area that the bad guys are interested in.
Fascinating. So Matthew is wondering, what if your computer is already encrypted? Can threat actors re-encrypt?
So yeah, if they have your so when you encrypt your local drive, to unencrypt it, you have to have your authentication. So if the bad guys have your credentials, they can unencrypt that drive and then encrypt it. Or even if your drive's encrypted, they can still encrypt it again, and then your drive is useless. What they can't do without your credentials is steal data from the drive because it's useless to them. But again, if they have your credentials, they can decrypt any file that's on there. And so that's, while encrypting hard drives are good and important, and encrypting your data is important, you want to make sure that you're not doing it in a way that can easily be unencrypted by any threat actor that lands on your network.
Okay, Dawson is asking, it says, so macros are now turned off by default in the Office 365 suite. Are there any other settings you recommend getting changed for security reasons?
So I think this is probably a question that Tim can answer in more depth, but yes, we could do a whole 30 minutes just on that. I highly recommend using GPO, and now I'm blanking on what GPO stands for, but it's the Microsoft sort of general, allows you to make configuration changes across the network. But you can do things like not allow local users, local Office users to have admin access. And you can disable capabilities where they're not needed. So, for example, if you don't need OneNote, you disable OneNote, across the entire network, so that even if an attacker does send an attachment with OneNote, that it won't necessarily be able to execute it. So Microsoft actually has some really good design documents on how to better secure Office 365 using GPO. I highly recommend checking those out. But yeah, there are a lot of things that you can do to continue and improve it, and maybe that is a separate coffee talk that we need to have at some point, John.
Fascinating. Let's see, we've got a question here from Ken. When a subsidiary is peeled off an existing Office 365 support contract, what top items should be part of a checklist of items to ensure no remnants of an attack vector remain?
Oh, that is a really good question. So, I mean, and it is. There's a lot of M&A activity happening right now, and Office is Microsoft 365 in general is one of those things that get overlooked. We look at things like firewall rules. We look at things like, endpoint guidelines and so on. But we don't always look at the software configurations between the two companies. And that can be really important. So, again, you want to make sure that you don't have things like joint admin accounts. If they're getting peeled off, none of their admins should have admin access to your organization anymore. You want to make sure that there's no commingling of the files anymore. So if everything was stored on a joint SharePoint server or a joint file server, you want to make sure that's all moved off and into kind of their own separate environment or their own separate cloud. And again, say that applies to the cloud as well. Once they're peeled off, you need to make sure that all the files have been moved to their cloud. And if they are staying a subsidiary, you want to make sure that whatever rule enforcement you have in place for your organization also gets passed over to them. So you're maintaining a level of security even across your subsidiary. So whatever guidelines you develop and document should be passed on to them to implement as well.
Okay, here's one from, let me look here, from Pierre, who's wondering, does Microsoft assist with restoring accounts that have been recently encrypted, or should we look for a third-party solution?
So I think Microsoft does have some incident response capabilities, but I think it is an extra cost. There are companies that specialize in restoration for Microsoft 365, so you may want to look at those. That's really kind of a question that you're going to want to have a conversation with your Microsoft salesperson so you understand the full scope of the contract, what's included and what isn't. Again, I think in some cases it is, but I do think there's an extra cost to that.
Okay, here's one from Greg. I want to be sure I'm saying this right. Greg's wondering, what about older desktop Microsoft Office suites? At what version was it that macros, I guess, were turned off as the default?
So it wasn't until this year. So basically any older version of Microsoft Office prior to this year likely has macros still enabled. That is one of those things where, again, you want to go into your settings and verify that if you aren't using Office 365 in the cloud, you're using the local version of it, that you want to go in and double check and verify that setting. That is one of those things that before you do that, though, you do want to you want to have a conversation with all the different groups in your organization to make sure they understand it's being turned off and why, and find out if there are exceptions that need to be made, especially like finance and accounting. People do really need their macros sometimes. And so you'll want to have like, okay, we're going to turn it off for everybody, but we're going to leave it on for this one, for this one policy group. And so don't just blanket turn it off. That can often create a lot of headaches.
Okay, William is wondering, how do you see how Microsoft 365 and other vendors respond as attackers begin to use add AL to their tool set?
Okay, can you clarify, William? Did you mean AI?
I was thinking this was going to be our AI question. Just to resubmit your question, William, I'm going to go ahead and go to, Tim is saying, yes, he did. So let's say he did, AI.
Yeah. It's interesting because both Microsoft is adding AI capabilities to their defenses, but we are starting to see, especially with the LLMs that are out there, we are starting to see threat actors also try and use various versions of AI to improve their capabilities, and especially when it comes to like writing phishing emails, things like that. Some of these LLMs can be really good at not carrying out attacks, but assisting with attacks. I never want to overhype anything, but it is concerning, and is something that we're going to continue to monitor. So, there is going to be AI on both sides, AI on the defense from Microsoft and other companies, but also AI used by the attackers. Fortunately, Microsoft's invested a lot more money in AI than the attackers have. But they have a much bigger attack surface to worry about too.
Mm-hmm. And it never ends. Okay, we got another question from Matthew, who's wondering, what does a OneNote attachment look like, and how can you see/detect what happens?
So the good news is OneNote attachment just has the OneNote extension on it. So if you're looking for attachments that have that extension, you'll be able to top it. And if it's not something that's regularly used in your network, you can block all OneNote extensions, depending on the capability of your mail security system and so on. Again, if it's not widely used in your organization, you can block all of those attachments. Just let your fellow employees know that you're doing that, so if there is anybody that's using it, they can let you know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. What have we got here? Okay, here's one. Beck is wondering, if hackers are able to bypass multi-factor authentication with some Microsoft 365 attacks, what other options for security are there?
So there are better and more effective multi-factor authentication tools. But there are also other checks that can be put in place as far as not just having the right username and password and multi-factor authentication key, but also, hey, where's this coming from? Like, the bad guy generally is not going to be connecting from inside your network. So that's probably a red flag, and there may be certain countries that nobody in your organization will be connecting from. So you're going to want to do more in terms of the kind of authentication you're using. So not just username, password, and key. You're also going to want to know more about the atmospherics of the person trying to make the connection. What kind of browser are they using? Again, where are they coming from? What operating system, and so on. And that is really how you start to detect even these complex attacks that are looking to bypass your multi-factor authentication.
Thank you so much, Alan. That's all the time we have for the questions for this first session.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, John. I love talking to you, and I love talking to everybody here.